Thank you very much. Right, shall we crack on? Kick-off time, as they say. I will tell you that story later about the dentist that remind me. But I did have some homework, didn't I, about rugby school, and I've done my homework. Would you believe rugby school at the moment has got it's got male and female pupils, which is certainly different, so that's a reflection in society. And rugby school in Warwickshire at the moment has got 863 pupils, but would you believe they've got 17 rugby teams? So that gives you an idea of what rugby does in terms of the profile of the school. And interestingly enough, their director of rugby is a certain Mike Bailey, ex-Western Province. So isn't that a link? So that was quite good bit of internet work.
You mentioned rugby. We were talking about it after the lecture yesterday. I got the picture of that advert for the last World Cup in England, the one where Johnny Wilkinson and Prince Harry.
Yes.
Gardens, and they're at rugby school.
At the rugby school, that's.
And picks up the ball and runs with it. And as he runs past Prince Harry turns around to Johnny Wilkinson and says, "Never mind, Johnny, it'll never take it."
Brilliant marketing, eh? Brilliant marketing. All down to William Webb Ellis, that we were just talking about now. Right, we've got a lot to get through, and I'm conscious of the time. There is somebody coming in after us, actually. A lecture that we attended, the Wreck of Harlem. So that was quite an interesting thing we attended yesterday, and he's in here after us. So I'm going to crack on. We're going to look at the global game today, as I said. It's going to lead on from yesterday. We're going to look at how rugby, or the history of sport, but certainly rugby, how it spread around the world. Because us historians like to find patterns in things, and it certainly fits in with patterns of how lots of other aspects of culture are spread around the world. So today, as I said, I like to point out what we're going to do. The British Empire, I keep talking about it, but it was significant. I think I made that clear yesterday, certainly in taking sport around the world. We need to understand how these sports were transferred, and there was a certain process. And it's problematic to create kind of models, but historians have done that. And I'm going to try and look at that in turn today. We're going to look at how that was achieved. And finally, we're going to look at a few case studies, in particular New Zealand. They're the nemesis, of course, of the Springboks. They're arguably the greatest rugby team at the moment. They have been for a while. And it's something certainly England and the Springboks look to emulate. So we're going to look at the case of New Zealand in particular. Tomorrow, of course, we're going to concentrate here in South Africa and for the rest of the week. But at the moment, we're just laying the basis of what we're doing here. Okay, so first of all, I keep using this word empire. What do we mean by empire? What does it actually mean? Well, if you think about it, we've all got friends who probably are empire builders, and what they want you to do is to come on board with their ideas. They want you to join the club, as it were. And that's what an empire basically was. The British Empire has been defined by a guy called Perkin within that period. We've traditionally thought of the empire in Britain's century, roughly 1815 to 1914. Now, we're going to talk about the South African War, which is the Anglo-Boer War, however you want to term it, later in the week. A lot of people think that was the start, certainly the start of the end of the British Empire. But the First World War changed things throughout world politics. So 1914 looks like certainly where we start looking at the real decline of the empire, because things changed. During that time, Perkins suggests that we need to see Britain in that century less as a narrow imperial power, more as an international superpower. Hard to believe now, really, as that little island's got even more narrow with Brexit and whatever, but it was an international superpower. Its political, economic and cultural tentacles reaching out to most corners of the earth. Politics, economics and culture. The key is they're all linked. Now, we're interested in a certain aspect of culture, which is sport, and one of the aspects of that of sporting imperialism was the spread of rugby throughout the world. I put this map of the world up, political map of the world in 1897. I put it up to my first year students, and I say, what is those areas in red? And I get some interesting answers. They, as you, I'm sure, have guessed, are the parts of the world that were controlled by Britain in 1897, part of the British Empire. Now, of course, we've got here down in the Cape Colony, we've got Australasia, New Zealand. Most important thing to notice, a lot of the strategic islands, a lot of the islands in the world were controlled by the British because Britain ruled the seas, and that was the thing. Canada, of course, big part of that. How Britain controlled this empire is what fascinated me, because yes, it has been a relatively overpopulated island for a lot of its recent history. But we were talking yesterday in a lecture yesterday evening, the Dutch created some kind of empire, but they did it by bringing in sort of hired hands. How did the British control the empire? Well, they did it through what they call cultural imperialism. It was methods of persuasion. Yes, there was, of course, military might, and there was forceful means as well, but a lot of it was done through persuasion, almost buying into the British club, the British way of life, through language, through education, through religion, and through culture. And one of those parts of that culture was sport. And that's why we still see something like cricket, probably the most English of games, being played with such passion in India to this day. Not only played in India, but controlled in India now. I mean, they are the powerhouse of world cricket. So that's how effective this cultural imperialism was. And of course, we're going to look at rugby, and we're going to see why places like New Zealand and Australia still play rugby, and of course here in South Africa. So that is the context in which I'm talking about. This is the period. So in 1897, the British Empire was at the height of its powers. Of course, there was going to be a little war down here in southern Africa that was going to certainly get in the way of things, and we'll talk about that as we go on. But what is the relevance of sport to empire? Well, certainly cultural factors are very important to the spread of the empire, and as I've said, historians, again, like to label things, but they've called it cultural imperialism. It's a form of way of persuading others to buy into your kind of way of life, as it were. And let's be frank, the world is too big to control by military alone. Now, often I think of a comparison. Let's think of a superpower in our generation, the Americans. Often the Americans like to dominate areas through military means. But if you think about it, certainly in the Middle East, areas like that, has their influence remained? No. And that's something that's quite subtle. So, of course, when it was needed, the British had a very powerful army and a very powerful navy, and they were brought into play. But remember, now, by increasing your influence throughout the world, you're increasing your army as well. So when Britain went to war during this time, it wasn't just Brits who were on the battlefields. It was South Africans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, because that was part of the club. This was the empire they were building. Part of the purpose of the empire was to transpose British values around the world. And as I've said, via rugby perhaps, because as I mentioned yesterday, rugby is a very special game. The game, a hooligan's game played by gentlemen. It encourages a certain code of behaviour. So if you could transfer those codes of behaviour to other parts of the world, therefore they perhaps became more attuned to your way of life, perhaps more British. Sport actually supports but occasionally subverts this idea of empire, and I'll look at that towards the end. There were certain parts of the empire which not only didn't take this idea of sport on, but they rejected it, and they created their own kind of notions of sport. But we'll come to that as we go on. Now, the model I was talking about. Historians have come up with this idea that the diffusion of sport around the world, including rugby to a certain extent, took place in 4 distinct stages. Now, I've got a problem with these kind of models because you're trying to say one size fits all. And it's far more subtle than that. But broadly speaking, there are aspects of this stage which do fit most countries within the British Empire. Now, stage 1 was the introduction of a sport abroad by officers and civil servants. Now, can you see the link there? Officers and civil servants tend to be from the middle and upper classes. So this is where this influence of sport came from. Now, the first men that arrived in a new colony were your military men and also your civil servants, certainly in a place like India, because they were the people that controlled large parts of India. Your British civil servants were very influential. Stage 2, the diffusion of sport to the indigenous colonial elite. In other words, who then took on these sports? The Brits were now playing in their little exclusive clubs, but often it was the local tribe leaders, the local princes in India that actually think, we want to be part of this. And that's how cricket, ironically enough, interestingly enough, was passed on through the ranks, should I say, in India, because of the caste system. Now, the caste system mirrored the class system of Britain. But how do you actually get persuaded that sport is good? Well, you look at your leaders. Now, the Raj brought into this idea of cricket, dressing like English gentlemen, playing this wonderful game, having tea at 4 o'clock. And that's how it spread down to the masses. So that's the second stage. Stage 3 is the eventual diffusion to what we call the local masses, so the man in the street. So if your leaders are playing this game and have bought into it, well, then, therefore they want to play. Now, that is similar to what's happening. We'll look at certainly New Zealand with rugby. The Maoris that we're going to be talking about, there is your colonial elite. There is it was the tribal leaders. They bought into rugby. So then the actual masses, or should we say the Maoris, actually bought into this game of rugby. Now, can you guess what the final stage was? Now you've got people in the colonies playing these games because it's almost filtered down. Well, you want to prove yourself. And that was actually playing the mother country. That's beating them at their own game. And it goes a full circle. And that's exactly what happened. That's what happened here in South Africa, and it's certainly what happened in New Zealand where we're looking at it. So these are the different stages we're going to be looking at today. So introduction. Yesterday we talked about public schools rugby. It was all about teaching men to be leaders. And it's all about preparation for imperial service and duty. So we talked about the Industrial Revolution. A lot of these public schoolboys went off into industry, but a lot went overseas to serve Queen and country, and they were the civil servants and the military men. So it was natural that they took this game that they learned at places like rugby school with them. It was effective in education. It was going to be effective in imperial life. Sport played in the empire was played by the officers and the civil servants serving there. And if we see time and time again the origins of rugby, who were the first to actually play this game? Often it was the military station there, or the British civil servants. Character building was part of this game of rugby that we talked about, which is still instilled in players today, learning the game. It was a major role in imperial life. Sport certainly was part of that. If you think about it, there's nothing easier than a rugby ball or a soccer ball to pack, and that's what literally they did, or a cricket ball. And as soon as you went away, you tend to take your own culture with you. And let's face it, the Brits do that better than anywhere else. I've travelled a large part of the world. Wherever there's British influence, you see reminders of home. You only have to drive around the southern suburbs and see the street names, for example. I mean, these little obscure little towns from Britain have been brought here. And that's something that you can see in any part of the old empire. Some sport, though, changed in character to suit the local environment. And I put South African rugby there because certainly Springbok rugby or South African rugby is different than what we've seen as the origins of the game. It's played in a certain style. There are aspects of the game that were transferred, but we're going to look at that more as we go on. The colonial elite. Well, indigenous elite adopted ways of British rulers, religion, education and culture. We may be pushing the point, but we have to look at recent influences in South Africa. Mbeki, Nelson Mandela, they bought into British education, of course. They're educated, the language, their professions. And if that is the case, then the masses will look up to these people. And that was what was happening when sport was first taken abroad. The most obvious example, as I said, is the Indian Raj with cricket. They bought into this game, therefore the masses wanted to emulate that. Sport was adopted by white and non-white locally, usually at their own prompting. Now this is where the question comes in, because the British are very much into clubs and exclusivity. They didn't go there saying, this is our sport, please play it. They kept it exclusive. But don't you think that's where the power comes? It's a bit like getting into a nightclub, isn't it? If everybody goes there, nobody's fussed. If it's an exclusive place, if there's a waiting list, we all want to get in. And that's how sport was viewed. There's the way these special pastimes, sport, cricket, the way people dressed and behaved, people wanted part of it. Certainly the local elite. It was a complex process, and as I said, this is a model that academics have tried to explain, but it fits some and doesn't fit all. It was all about establishing positive relations. As I said, the empire was built upon persuasion as much as military means. So if you could persuade the local leaders that this was the way to live, therefore we hopefully could avoid war and military conflict. New sports were adopted by the British too, and this is an interesting one. It was a two-way process. So if we look at polo, for example, that actually came from India. So the British weren't averse to actually suiting their own sporting needs to the local environment. And remember, we can be as theoretical as we want about this game of rugby, but it does come down to environment. It is played in a certain way. Perhaps that's why it's not played in the extreme heat or on extreme hard grounds, but we only have to tell some people playing rugby in the Karoo about that, don't we? So the game is overcome here in terms of that. Finally, this is also to say stage 3, the local masses. Now this is important, but there is a little evidence of a deliberate attempt for the British to actually encourage people to join in their games. We all know, as I said, that the British like clubs. They like to keep things exclusive. There's a hierarchy even in sport. When we talk about that in terms of rivalry, you know, the game of rugby, perhaps not so much, but if you look at sports like golf, etc., I mean, there's certain rules. These aren't open clubs to everybody. So there's little evidence of a deliberate attempt to spread sport by the British. Locals were often excluded, and we know that here in South Africa due to the colour of their skin. Elsewhere, it may have been due to their class, which is a slightly more complex or not such an obvious matter to explore. Exclusivity. Clubs were formed to keep similar people together, should we say. Therefore, it was up to the local masses to emulate the leaders, to emulate the British, to actually say, we can play this game, we can take you on at your own game. And that's exactly what I'm going to say. This questions this idea that British purposely took their culture around the world. It was almost later that they could see the purpose or the virtues of sport and how it was teaching people to behave and how it kept people on board. Because this final, I'm jumping ahead here. Let's look before we go there. I'm just thinking about this idea that not all nations took up the idea of playing sport in the same way. And this particular case study, the Aussies, now that's the one thing we've got in common, the Brits and the South Africans, we have to have a dig at the Aussies. They are interesting when it comes to playing sport, aren't they? I'm going to be careful, but there we are, let's move away. I can say this in a rather qualified way because I taught in Australia for a number of years, and I asked the students, for my own, it was really for my own sort of mischief. I said to them, "What is it? Give me a characteristic of being Australian." And I asked 4 separate classes, independently. They all said the same thing: sport and being good at it. That was interesting. Now they went on to the next rich part of their culture, beer, barbecues, and stuff like that. But it was sport, but it was being good at it. It was nothing about fairness or equality. It was, we are the best. And I thought that was interesting. And that's something that the Australians did. Now, Australia, of course, was created in an unusual way. The Brits took their prisoners down there, and the penal colony was established. Now, perhaps that's part of it. We haven't got time to do a study of Australia, but the mindset is we are going to take this sport and we're going to beat you at your own sport, and we're going to create our own essence around it. And we know that cricket and rugby was certainly successfully adopted. Their football, their soccer is quite successful at the moment, but these were the 2 sports that they adopted from the British. But it wasn't about adopting it unquestionably. Now, you think you've been sent down to the other side of the world, you're not necessarily going to buy into this British class system. And that's where the Australians, I admire them, because they set their society on equality. That's the basis of it. They say there's no such thing as a class system in Australia, but I think we're human beings, so there's a hierarchy. But there's this equality, and it comes from that history. If we think about it, Australian cricket's got a certain flavour, hasn't it? We're not going to talk about ball tampering. We're not going to talk about cheating. I was there in March, so I was there watching it happen, which was incredible. But they do play cricket in a certain way. There is a toughness, there is a gamesmanship side to it that perhaps has gone too far. We can talk about that another time. But they also form their own sports, Australian rules. Now, that's an amalgam of certain sports. It's an incredible sport to watch live, but instead of just taking on British forms of sport, we're going to create our own, much as the Irish did with GAA, etc. We'll talk about that in a bit. But it's all about that, nationalism through sport. The Aussies took cricket and rugby and they created it in their own image, much like South Africa has done throughout its history. And it's all about nationalism through sport. If you think about it, the question is, do you create your own sport? Perhaps as the Americans do. They have a baseball, for example, they call it the World Series. Or do you take on the Brits at their own game, which is certainly cricket and rugby, which are those empire games, and that's what they've done. People like Richard Cashman have said Australia is a paradise of sport, a bit like South Africa. I mean, the weather, the facilities, it's geared up to making this a sporting nation. And as I said, as recently as 2010 when I was studying there, independently students still identify themselves as a sporting nation. Sport united a divided nation, less class-driven than the British model. Now, having lived there, I think Australia is quite a divided nation in terms of that, but it's more subtle. The one thing, a bit like South Africa, they've all got in common is supporting the national team in doing well. They have a preference in sport, but the Australians are passionate about sport, but not just sport per se, doing well in it and being the best. And there's nothing better when the old enemy comes to town and they can beat the Brits. They beat the Poms, as it were. So that's Australia in terms of changing the way that sport was actually played. But we've got to remember, there were Australians, real Australians, before the colony was created, however it was created. And we know that, this is what I'm suggesting, that it is an unequal society because the original inhabitants, the Aborigines, are still not represented in their sporting teams as perhaps they should be. So finally, this was the stage I wanted to get to. Why are we so concerned about beating the mother country, beating the Poms, the Brits, whatever you want to call us? Well, it's a coming of age, you see. You cannot prove you've learnt this game and achieved heights in it unless you've actually beaten the inventors. So it's like any sport you can pick. If you want to be the best in ice hockey, you've got to beat the Canadians. The Brits invented rugby and cricket, so they're the team to beat. They're the team to rub your nose in it, to rub their noses in it, especially. It's a coming of age. It's a sign of approval. All right, the Australians may say, this love-hate relationship, but certainly in places like New Zealand, it was a sign of approval. You didn't have that antagonistic relationship. South Africa, we're going to look at in the next few days, certain groups were more anti-British than others, so therefore it was a coming of age. But also, it symbolised brotherhood. Rugby, as we saw yesterday, was a game that trained soldiers. You did your duty. Now, all of a sudden, if you could spread this message of rugby around the world, you're increasing your armed forces. So in their thousands, rugby players from New Zealand, Canada, Australia, South Africa signed up for the British war effort in the First and the Second World Wars, and actually throughout those struggles. We've seen that. So it was effective in doing that. At first, it was subservience. We see that. Oh, thank you for playing us. We look at the first tours. They came down here, and it was almost as though the Brits, we welcome you here. Thank you for bringing the game. But then, of course, it changed. We are now going to teach you a few lessons. And it came with the emergence of independence and nationalism, and they're the two big things. How do you prove that you're an independent country, you can stand on your own? Well, one of the things is actually to be very good at sport that was creating this national identity. Now, we look at certain tours. Now, we'll look at these in more detail in a bit, but in 1905-06, there was an all-conquering New Zealand rugby tour. That was the first All Blacks tour to the United Kingdom. Not only did they go there and wipe the floor with everybody, apart from the Welsh, unfortunately, the Welsh just pipped them, but can you imagine the significance of that? You've taken this sport to the other side of the world, in New Zealand's case, and in 1905, that team had the temerity, the cheek, to come into your own backyard and actually, as the South Africans would do a year later, teach you a lesson in the game that you've taken. And that's an effective way of taking culture around the world, isn't it? In a way, I think it's a backhanded compliment that the Brits did such a good game in taking this sport and teaching these colonies well in it. 1906, we'll talk more about this famous team during the week, was the birth of the Springboks. Only in 1906. We think South Africa has played rugby forever, but the Springboks certainly came about at the start of the 20th century. So let's look at New Zealand in particular. I could have picked any case study for today's lecture, but I wanted to look at New Zealand. I think that it's quite an interesting context. And again, if you'll forgive me, it's hard to sum up a country's history in a few bullet points, but that's what I'm just going to do to set the context. Well, we know that the indigenous population, certainly Pacific Islanders, were living there prior to the first sighting from a European in 1642. As you can see, it's the Dutch. Again, great explorers. The Dutch East India Company at that time was exploring. It was only in 1769, well, that famous man, not the ex-England cricket captain, but Captain Cook, That's where a comparison comes, isn't it? Captain Cook, they call him. It was rediscovered by the English. I mean, how can you discover a country or an island that was already there? But it was claimed by the English in 1769. The prospect of this country becoming quite lucrative was soon clear. In the late 1780s, European whalers, sealers arrived, followed by merchants. New Zealand was going to be different from Australia. As I said, Australia was largely populated by prisoners. It was a penal colony. Well, New Zealand was different for various reasons, especially because of the people that living there, the Maori tribe. The Maori population, the Pacific Islanders living there, they were different to the Aborigines. This was going to be a different kettle of fish for the British to colonize this area. Soon they realized that this warring nation, this developed society and culture, it was better to work with them than against them. And that's part of how sport was spread there. We know that the British are very persuasive when it comes to trade. European goods were traded with the Maoris, the developed society. And unfortunately, one of the things that the Europeans did bring down was guns. So it changed the dynamic of the whole thing. All of a sudden, if there was going to be any trouble, it was going to be fought in a different way. And that was going to lead to some problems. They literally had shot themselves in the foot with that. Shortly after, missionaries, religion. As I said, it's the same pattern. Often soldiers, traders, and then on their heels comes religion. So Church of England missionaries arrived from Sydney in the early 1800s. And then there was a systematic process of colonization. You needed to put Europeans, certainly British people, in the mass on that island to populate it. And between 1820 and 1840, certainly the New Zealand Company was founded and this systematic colonization began. It was all about turning this far-off island into a European enclave. For example, in 1840, the town of Wellington was created by settlers fleeing hardship at home in England, Scotland and Ireland. This was a mixture, of course. It wasn't just English, it was the Scots, the Irish, as well as Welsh, going down to New Zealand, making a new home. If we look at the provinces in 1871, this was how it was administered, of course. Both North and South Island were divided up, almost in the county system of the UK. So again, it's the Brits administering a country in the early days as they would administer their homeland. Auckland, Hawke's Bay. I nearly ended up living in Hawke's Bay. I was offered a job there a number of years ago. Beautiful, beautiful winelands and whatever, but it just reminded me too much of Somerset. It was just green. I thought, I've come to the other side of the world to stay in a place that was like the West Country. But you can understand the appeal of New Zealand. Certainly here in the south, where I've been down here. If you've ever been to Otago and places like that, I mean, it's like Scotland, and that's where a lot of Scots settled. So it was familiar. It didn't have the obvious hardships of Australia with the climate, of course, and the barren interior. This was a fertile land. So the British, as empire builders, were treating it in a different way. If we look at the people born in the UK, living in New Zealand provinces in 1871, we can see that there's certainly a fair scattering of Brits living there. English, Scottish and Irish throughout each of the provinces. But here, as you can see the patterns. Otago, Southland, this is where the Scottish influence was. So certain groups went down there and picked places that were familiar or felt familiar to home. But what about the Maori issue, as I call it here? Well, they were indigenous to New Zealand since 1300 AD. Of course, the Polynesian islands. They've been entrenched on these two islands since that time. So it was an entrenched community. It was a society that the British would have to deal with, or certainly trade with, or certainly communicate their culture through if they were going to be successful. Because unlike the Aborigines, there was a really strong heritage here. There was a class system, and perhaps this is where the British had something in common. There was a class system amongst the Maoris. You had chiefs, freemen, you even had slaves within the Maori history. So if you can relate to some kind of hierarchy, much as they did with the caste system in India, you had more of a chance of transferring your culture, especially when it came to things like sport. We know that there was interaction. The Maori chiefs travelled to Britain to see the source of these wonderful European goods as early as 1820. So it was a two-way kind of transfer. They were buying into this Western culture. However, the 1837 report on the Aborigines also reported about the New Zealanders. So all of a sudden, the Brits were aware that this was a different kettle of fish. They had to treat the Maoris in a different way. So in 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed by 50 Maori chiefs. They agreed that the Queen's sovereignty was supreme, but it was a treaty. There was no force involved initially. It was going to be a treaty, and it was done through barter and trade, of course. Tribes got possession of their own land, but they had sale rights that was handed to the Queen. To the Queen, to the Crown, of course. So all of a sudden now the British have moved in, and they've actually allowed them to have possession of their own lands, which was, as we can see now, quite devious. The natives of New Zealand received rights as British citizens. Now, how do you persuade this proud group of people to get on board? Well, one of the things was to spread your culture, and of course we talked about taking wonderful goods down there and showing them, technology and guns, for example, but also introducing your own culture, and rugby was going to play an important part of this. However, it didn't go particularly to hand. Now, if we look at Lord Russell, House of Commons in 1850, this is how the British viewed this New Zealand problem. There is now in one of our recent colonies a most remarkable race. I mean, the population of New Zealand, which not many years ago was given up to practices the most abhorrent to humanity, but which, from intercourse and communication with our countrymen, appears to be far more capable of civilization than almost any of the savage races with which we have come into contact. This is the language of the House of Parliament in 1850. And the one thing we've got to realise is British sport was taken around the world with this incredible kind of sense of superiority. And this is where this exclusive thing comes in. But good old Lord John Russell has given the stamp of approval. We can actually now deal with these people. However, it didn't go smoothly. There were wars. In 1843, the first Maori Wars. And look what this chap is carrying. So some things perhaps weren't best imported. So it did take a while to put these revolts down, because the Maoris soon realised there were the more independent thinkers. They realised what the Brits were doing, of course. But that is part of the culture. They're a warrior people. We see this, of course, at the start of a rugby match, don't they? It's a proud part of their culture. So it wasn't that easy for the British to get their own way. So, as a result of the war, troops were sent down to put down this uprising. And of course, New Zealand sport was then boosted by the influx of imperial troops. In 1856, eventually, of course, in 1856, New Zealand was granted its own government. But that shows that there was trust in the people there, and it was given its own government. It didn't have to be controlled from Westminster. It was slightly different than other colonies at this time. 1860-70, guerrilla warfare continued. Not all Maoris bought into to the Brits coming down and taking over, but eventually that was quelled. Eventually, in 1867, the Maoris were granted the vote. Now that is a big, big thing, because obviously it took a long time for the indigenous population of Africa and South Africa to be given the vote. So to be given the vote in 1867, when women weren't even allowed to vote in Britain, was quite a significant thing. So it shows a two-way respect here, and certainly an appreciation of the power of the Maoris. In 1877, education was made free and compulsory. This is when rugby became very popular in schools. We know our rugby timeline from yesterday, so this fits in with it. In 1941, New Zealand was keen to send 100,000, including over 2,000 Maoris, to World War I. Look at the population. Incredible how this country was going to increase or serve the nation. That's white population, by the way. I can see you looking at that. By 1925, the Maori population was reduced from 120,000 in the early 1800s to 54,000. So through various marginalisation, disease, etc., it was this Western lifestyle, and the change in New Zealand was certainly hitting the Maori population. Europeans not only dominant now in politics, but in numbers as well. So the Brits did come down and they took over. So what about sport? Colonial New Zealand. Well, we know that sport was cultural baggage of British immigrants. Certainly, we look at the various regions, it became home. So South Island was settled by a large Scottish population, as I said, very, very similar to Scottish towns if you go to any of those small towns down there. Religion and imperial education preached a British way of life, British rule, white race, and colonial identity. Distance makes the heart grow fonder. I find that in South Africa. Quite often, little enclaves of South Africa are more British than Britain. And it was certainly the case in New Zealand. You are a long way from home, so this identity, this fondness for the home was stronger. And this is when the adoption of British sporting pastimes, of course, hunting, racing, bowls, cycling, tennis, cricket, and rugby. Rugby became the dominant sport in New Zealand. You're probably asking why, so let's look at that now. Rugby was favoured over football. Now, football was played down in New Zealand, but rugby became the premier winter sport. Now, Victorian rules, that's Australian rules football. That also had an influence there. That was played to a certain extent, but rugby became the premier winter sport. First played in Nelson in 1870. By 1890, there were 700 or more clubs. Now, that was quite an expansion. Now, I think there's comparisons here with South Africa. We can go and look at theories why rugby was adopted, but we look at the actual people, the men that were playing the sport at the time. These were frontiersmen. These were big men, a lot of them living on the land, a lot of them farmers, a lot of them doing heavy work. Well, they probably tended to favour something like rugby, a physical game that suited their character more than crown green bowls. So we can be too theoretical about it, but we know that in the schools it was encouraged. So therefore, these young men coming out of the schools would then form clubs. So look at that for an expansion. Old boys for England would go down to New Zealand and certainly be influential within the public schools, and they took rugby with them. The New Zealanders, as I said, prided themselves as pioneers. Rugby suited their tough frontier environment. But it also appealed to the warrior tradition of Maoris. As I said, this wasn't all plain sailing for the British. They actually had to go to war with the Maoris to get control. So therefore, rugby, perhaps as a combative sport, suited everybody's character. And as I said, this is a matter of opinion, but we know that the colonial rugby culture involved pioneering spirit, a work ethic, community identity, colonial pride, and aggressive masculinity. And where does that play itself out? This aggressive masculinity, this warrior pose. Every time anybody plays the Springboks, they've got to face that terrifying scene down, haven't they? And this masculinity is played out within the New Zealand or All Black psyche as we speak today. It's almost adopted as part of their character, of course. But there's a contrast, of course, because the All Blacks, as they soon became known, in this New Zealand masculine identity. At first it was about New Zealand being part of the empire, but later it was about them creating their own identity, and that's what the All Blacks are so important, even today. You know, New Zealand is a long way from anywhere, let's not forget it. We know them as the premier, the leading, if not the number one, rugby nation for a number of years, and the New Zealand All Blacks are part of that. Originally, though, you had characters like this chap, and this was all about loyalty to empire. Now, I could have picked out any number of players. Early success of the All Blacks reinforced the dominant political culture, but there was also a loyalty to Commonwealth and monarchy. Now, this chap, Colin Meads, at one time was the most capped All Black. Now, he was known as a loyal subject of the crown, but he was very patriotic in playing for the All Blacks. Now, forgive me, I think that's where the New Zealanders, when I've travelled there, and Australia, that's where I find the contrast today. They haven't got a problem with the Poms. The Australians are always trying to beat us, and I think that's where it comes from. There's a pride in having that British connection. It's not always questioned, and certainly when it comes to the history of rugby, that was played out. You could be a loyal subject, as we saw to the number of people or the number of men that went and offered their lives for Queen and country or King and country during the years. But you could also be a patriotic New Zealander or Kiwi. The conflict was easier. It fitted. Whereas I feel with Australia, even today, there is tension there with having the flag and the national anthem and the Queen as sovereign. It's always there is that tension. The All Blacks This was the first team in 1905. They came to Britain, and as I said, they wiped the floor. They taught the Brits their own game. Now, a bit like with the Springboks, we'll talk about the green jersey and the Springbok in the days to come. But this is when the Kiwi emerged, the identity of the Kiwi, the all black fern, etc. And all of a sudden, cartoons was created, because now it was the pupil turning on the teacher. The Kiwi giving the lion a bit of a lesson on the rugby field. Wonderful cartoons from that time. So the rise of New Zealand national identity. We know that the New Zealand All Blacks, the famous team in 1905, toured Britain and lost only one game. It's still disputed whether it was a try or not, but the Welsh say we're the only team that beat the Kiwis in 1905. The natural and healthy conditions of colonial life produces stalwart and athletic sons, of whom New Zealand and the Empire are justly proud. Who said that? Well, it was the New Zealand Premier, Richard Seddon, at the time of the tour. Seddon also suggested the results of the tour were received in New Zealand almost as eagerly as reports of the South African War had been. Isn't that interesting? Because we know that the Kiwis sent a large contingent here to South Africa during the Anglo-Boer War. So there wasn't that. Even though you wanted to beat the Brits at their own game, it didn't have that strong national purpose at the time. You could still be a loyal member of this empire club, but prove yourself on the rugby field. I think that's what makes New Zealand quite interesting. So what is the legacy of that? Well, we know that Maori influence and distance from home are major factors in the white settlement of New Zealand. Settlers brought with them a cultural baggage, of course, including rugby with them. Early New Zealand society and sport was based on the British model, but we know that sporting success led to a nationalist identity, that what it was to be a New Zealander. And that's why rugby, like here in South Africa, is so much entrenched as part of New Zealand identity. While cricket remained subservient, New Zealand rugby was subject to colonial adaptation, and we only have to look at the Maori haka. Now, Maoris, as we'll see tomorrow, were represented in New Zealand's team, and that of course caused problems during the apartheid era here, but they were accepted. They didn't play in the numbers perhaps they should, but they were part of the makeup of New Zealand's national teams. So unlike elsewhere, imperial relations between Britain and New Zealand were actually strengthened on sporting fields and demonstrated on the battlefields, as we know, during the Boer War and World War I. So that's New Zealand touched upon. But I keep talking about this spread of an idea, this spread of rugby around the world. Now, I don't want to go too academic here, but I think let's just mention it. The interpretations of sport and empire, this cultural imperialism, well, it's linked to ideas of Karl Marx, Marxism and conflict theory. In other words, what do you think the British were more like? Did they spread their ideas via cultural imperialism? In other words, did they impose their values on nations, or did they, perhaps, the ideas of Antonio Gramsci, was it through a process of hegemony? In other words, was it through persuasion? Power can only be kept by getting the colonies to accept and believe the values of those in control. Now, various colonies, of course, kicked back and certainly didn't want to do that, but I believe it was more to do with hegemony. It's no good imposing your will on. It's like a friend. It's no, you can give them your opinion, but if you don't persuade them, perhaps it's part of their idea and they buy into it. Therefore, it's more effective. I often say to my students, right, we're all going to do some homework tonight. You're going to write an essay. I can tell you to write an essay, or I can persuade you that it's good for you to write the essay. Of course, the essay will be written. What do you think they would have bought into more? And that's how I think culture was actually spread in terms of this way. Because you can impose your values on a country, but if it's through subtle means of persuasion, this is more effective. However, we know that both ideas show that there was intent. There is little evidence of this, of course. It's historians looking back on it. Rugby was not taken purposely and implanted. It was almost like a seed that evolved, but we can see patterns. We know that sport, certainly the British, wanted to keep sport exclusive. Now that, of course, contradicts my whole notion of sport being taken for a purpose. Because the Brits love to be exclusive. They love to set up clubs. We've seen it in South Africa. British-style clubs that were exclusive and excluded members of the local population. So this is all I can say, and it probably keeps me on the fence. History is more complex than simple theories allow. But but that's what academics like to do, and we are, at the end of the day, in UCT, so we've got to be a bit theoretical about this. So whether you believe that the British did this purposely, I don't think any of us in the room would argue against the fact that they were successful in implanting their sporting ideas and their behaviours around the world, and we can see that in the rugby playing nations of the world. But the exceptions. Not all countries took to this. As we said, Australia was slightly different. That's why I've taken it out. But there are three cases I want to look at very, very briefly here. I do believe that local conditions were important. Now, when I mean local conditions, it could be climatic conditions, but it could be politics, and it could be past history with Britain. So not all nations took up British sport. And of course, I'm glad Alan's in the room, because this is a subject close to your heart. Ireland is an interesting one. Now, I was a lecturer at the University of Ulster in Belfast. It was my first academic position, and it taught me to be very, very careful in the classroom what I said. Can you imagine? I'm teaching, I can't believe I did it now, it was naivety. They said, Dean, you've got a third-year module, you can teach what you want. Do you know what I taught? Sport in the British Empire. Why I did it, I don't know. Because half of the class, of course, were Republicans. They were predominantly, we had the Catholic Protestant split. We had Unionists and Republicans within the classroom. I soon realised I had to be very, very tactful, and it certainly made me appreciate teaching in South Africa to a lesser extent, but it was quite an introduction, wasn't it? I learnt to not refer to Ireland or Northern Ireland. We had to call it the island of Ireland, and that's something as simple as that. But if anything, it really was good training for me, because I understood how sport was entrenched within this divide that's part of course, the island's history. What about rugby, though? Now, I'm sure Alan can chip in, and I hope you will, because Ireland is a proud rugby-playing nation. But the Irish, or some of the Irish, like the Scots and some of the Welsh, are pretty anti-English. So why would they take on this very game that emerged from the English public schools? Well, they did, and they have done, and let's face it, they're doing quite well at it at the moment, aren't they, the last few years? We know that Ireland has, or certain aspects, or certain communities of Ireland have a strong sense of anti-Britishness. Large parts of the population, but remember, Ireland was part of the British Empire. I mean, as recent as the early 1900s. But the independent thinkers, the Republican Irish, actually rejected British sport in favour of creating their own games. The Gaelic Athletic Association was formed in 1884. Now, if you look at the minutes and the structure of the GAA, which was formed arguably as an anti-British movement, in other words, we are not going to play British sports, we are going to play our own sport. Now, that's an interesting thing. Whether the Australian rules was formed in the same way, I doubt, but this was very much a political motive. But the Irish, I'm sorry, Alan, whether you like it or not, are like the Brits. We're very close geographically. And as people, we know, and I think the Irish knew what the Brits were doing. It's all very well going to the other side of the world and trying to colonise and saying that our way of life is better, but the Irish weren't going to have that. So if you look at the constitution of the GA, it's written up just like the constitution of the RFU, or the Football Association. Exactly the same. So they were being very British in the way that they created this sports organisation, but now they had Gaelic football and hurling, which they played independent of the British. And of course, within Irish schools, they were encouraged to play those sports. So even today, throughout Ireland, the sport you play can define your politics, can define your identity. So it is not removed. And remember what we said yesterday, sport and society are linked. You have to look at society to look at sport. And boy, did I learn that in a big way. Politics is sport. Sport is politics. Wherever you go, certainly in Ireland. Since 1875, Irish rugby remains largely middle class, and I've put here, and it's contentious, I know, it avoids the wider politics, because you know what? Unlike football, you haven't got a Northern Irish team and an Irish team. You've got a team that plays for Ireland. And people have written about it. No borders. Can you just explain how rugby people in Ireland, regardless of their politics, how they accept that in terms of the Irish team that represents them.
It's never disputed we support the national team which represents the island. The interesting introduction of an Irish anthem called Ireland's Call, which we sing when we're away from home, and the Irish national anthem, which is the anthem of the Republic of Ireland, we sing in Dublin, but we don't sing in Belfast. Sort of the subtleties of the sport. It also intrigues me as to why in the Republic of Ireland, the middle class student you refer to, all of the Roman Catholic ones all play rugby. Blackrock, Castlemount, Belvedere, Presentation Brothers, Christian Brothers, all play really good rugby. The Roman Catholic schools in Northern Ireland don't play rugby. They play Gaelic football. And those of us from the rugby tradition are working hard at trying to change that.
Yeah. Yeah.
With some difficulty.
Yeah, yeah. It's an incredibly complex situation, which is not only divides the north and south, but also regions as well. I mean, there's a hotbed of cricket in Northern Ireland I wasn't aware of before. Yeah, and there's the irony. So that sport, and as we'll probably will unpick more and more, you'll see it's linked to identity, it's linked to politics, it's linked to society. So.
The headquarters of the British and Irish Lions, the headquarters of Irish Rugby Football Union, the headquarters of the European Cup, the headquarters of
But arguably one of the hotbeds of rugby is Ulster in the north.
The headquarters of World Rugby, which reminded me of Dublin as well.
But it's all contested, of course. I mean, this has been built up and but why rugby? And why doesn't football do this? Well, again, I believe it comes to the actual foundations of the game. The class of the game, the type of people that play it, how it's been taught, and that's interesting. If I can just go on now, because I'm conscious of the time, Canada's an interesting one. Now I talk about local conditions, and that's what I probably mean in Canada. Well, local conditions are slightly different. Well, heavily influenced by neighbouring America. Now there's an empire, there's a big cultural superpower. Now if you're next door to America, you've got to be influenced by as much as they wouldn't admit it, of course, proud Canadians, you've got to be influenced by sport that's played in America. So if we look at, it's a mix of British and American sport. Canadian football, not rugby, was favoured, which is a sort of a hybrid version. And then, of course, they created their own sports, ice hockey and lacrosse. Lacrosse, a native Indian game, but ice hockey actually suited to local conditions. So we can be as theoretical as we want. Rugby perhaps is not played in Canada because you don't play it on frozen ground, whereas ice hockey, with their long winters, they became very good at that part of their identity. Now what we're going to look at is how various population groups have given rugby its flavour. Well, large French and Scottish populations resisted the English ethos of sport, because we know what the French and the Scots have got in common, a dislike for the English. Now, that is a massive influence in Canada, obviously a big French speaking part, and a big Scottish expat community there as well. Now, while the Scots are a great rugby playing nation, of course, perhaps once they've left the United Kingdom, they want to create their own identity, so perhaps that's part of it. Now, the last one that I just wanted to touch on, we're going to go into more detail, is this, South Africa. How did South Africa reject this notion? Of course, it accepted rugby, but this notion of British-style sport. Well, not all South Africa did that, of course. Now, I'm going to show you in the next few days how the South African War, the Anglo-Boer War, actually affected the diffusion of sport. Often we can see there's certain times in our history where sport has changed the character of sport. And certainly this, which was largely a civil war, you could argue, here in South Africa, it was absolutely devastating to this country. It defined a lot of things, affected the diffusion of sport. Largely speaking, we could say post-Boer War, the Afrikaners rejected cricket but embraced rugby to beat the English at their own game. Again, a massive generalisation, but we do see that pattern develop. We know that the black population actually adopted, should we say, the more democratic game of football, soccer, which was relatively free of an association with the white population. And that we know, football, whether we like it or not, is the most popular game in this country for all groups. So it's something I've got to keep referring back to. But it just shows you local conditions, local politics certainly influence the spread of this game of rugby. Now, I could go on, I could talk about Wales and whatever. I mean, Wales is another interesting one. I mean, rugby is a religion in Wales. I mean, I studied in Cardiff.